Special thanks to our promotional partners at the American Philatelic Society.
The APS is the largest stamp collecting organization in the world, supporting collectors of any level worldwide.
For more information about membership and APS services, visit stamps.org.
I'm Charles Epting from HR Harmer in New York City.
I'm Michael Cortese of Noble Spirit in Pittsfield, New Hampshire.
And this is Conversations with Philatelists. Now, Michael, this is one that we've been waiting for a long time. This is one that you persisted. You scheduled this. When I was trying to find the Zoom link, you actually scheduled this call 2 months ago. So that's why I was like, Michael, you didn't send me a Zoom link. And then I went back in my email history. So this is one we've had on the agenda for a long time. Why don't you tell people who we're going to be talking to?
So today we're talking to Dr. Christy Pottroff. We've been waiting to talk to her. You said I sent it in November. Before then we had it scheduled. We've been waiting to talk to her for 5 or 6 months now. So she works at Boston College.
I was going to say, this is not a name that will be familiar to collectors.
No, not at all. She works at Boston College as a professor of English.
So she's a professor of literature.
Yeah.
I'm wondering why you invited her on Conversations with Philatelists then. I feel like you may have forgotten the title of our podcast, Michael.
Guilty. No, I'm going to leave it up to her to explain.
But there is a postal connection here.
There's the strongest postal connection.
Okay. This is not some newfound interest in English literature that you...
No, you're definitely... If you're interested in the post office or collecting stamps, you're definitely going to want to take a listen to this one.
Well, that's great. Let's have her on. I'm excited. I'm excited to hear about this because, again, I don't think we've had a literature professor. Let's bring her on. I'm excited.
Let's bring her in. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Hi.
Hi there.
Charles.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for joining us, taking the time to...
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, excellent. How have you been before we start doing things?
Life is weird, but good. I have little to complain about. So, and it's delightful to talk to people about the post office. It's been a while since that's happened, so I'm happy for that. I'm in Massachusetts, so it's winter. Wintry now, but I miss the sun, but it's still nice enough to go for walks now and then. Mm-hmm. How about y'all? Where are you zooming in from?
So I'm in New Hampshire, Pittsfield, New Hampshire, just 20 minutes outside of Concord.
Nice.
And I'm in New York City.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
Yeah. So it relatively the same as far as winter goes.
Right. I'm from Kansas originally, the Midwest, and the sun still comes out in the winter. January and February. Every once in a while, you'll have a sunny day.
Yeah, I'm a California transplant. I've been here about a year and a half, so I'm still that storm. What was it? 3 weeks ago now was. That was a bit of a culture shock for me.
No, it's pretty. But yeah, nobody tells you everyone on the East Coast is grouchy because of vitamin D deficiency. But learned that one myself.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So thank you so much, Dr. Pottroff, for meeting with us, taking the time out of your schedule to talk to a couple of philatelists. To kick things off, do you mind talking a little about what you do as a professor?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for having me here. It's really awesome to run into other people who are really excited about the post office and know about the details. Yeah, I'm talking to people who aren't quite as familiar with how things worked in the past. So this will be fun. So I'm in the English department at Boston College. Actually, I teach classes on early American literature, and my research interest, the book that I'm working on, is about how American literature was transformed by the post office. So how increased speeds of transmission, kind of better service, postal service, kind of the universal service mandate largely created American literature as we know it over the course of the 19th century. So my book project, I look at how postal technologies and certain changes to the way how mail was delivered shaped, kind of sparked new changes in literature. So one of the chapters that I'm most excited about, I kind of recently kind of revised a draft of it, looks at how the stagecoach as a mail delivery vehicle actually gave rise to travel writing in the 1830s. Because if you're familiar with the way mail was delivered in the beginning of the 19th century, the U.S. Post Office Department contracted with private stagecoach companies, paid much of the operating costs with the postal subsidy that they received. And because of that, tickets for passenger stagecoach travel were very cheap. And it meant writers like Washington Irving, Anne Royal, who's a writer who nobody really talks too much about, but who wrote a lot in the 1830s, would ride the stagecoach all over the country, just describing what they saw. So, and at the same time, so this stagecoach kind of worked to expose people to new parts of the country, and also some of these writers had kind of this business savvy to actually bring trunks of their books that they'd written previously along with them. So the stagecoach became this almost site of literary production and distribution, thanks to the post office. So that's what my research looks like in the book. But in the classroom, it looks a little bit different, but it's still really focused on what the post office looked like in the 19th century and kind of hanging on to those material details. So one of the things that I do, especially if I'm reading, or if we're reading stories by Edgar Allen Poe or Herman Melville, who wrote Bartleby the Scrivener, is to really look at the way that mail was delivered, the way that letters worked in those decades, and see how that changes our interpretation of the story. So there's a famous story by Edgar Allan Poe that's called The Purloined Letter. It's one of his detective stories that he wrote in 1843, but was first published in 1845. And if you know about postal history, that kind of transitional moment was really important, just in terms of what letters looked like, the price of postage. So I have my students research, kind of what it would take to send a letter in 1843, what the cost would look like, and then how that changed in 1845, and then how those changes really inform our understanding of the story. So for Poe in particular, in this case, are you familiar with the Purloined Letter? Have either of you read this?
I read it ages ago.
Yeah, I haven't quite some time.
That's fine. Yeah, well, if you have some free time, it's a good one to take up if you're interested in postal history, because the material letter matters a lot. So basically, if I were to condense the plot of this story, a police officer is desperately searching for a lost letter that is supposed to have very salacious details of an affair that some royal unnamed person had written, and that kind of remains a secret throughout the story. But the police detective knows who stole the letter. He knows it's in this apartment, and then he spends days and days over the course of, I think in the story it's months, searching this apartment high and low for this letter. And it turns out the letter itself was just pinned in a letterbox, hidden in plain sight. So the story, kind of recounts what it means to kind of be looking for something that is hidden in plain sight. But it was written in this transitional moment when envelopes came into usage much more. And immediately after the story was written and when it was published, this understanding of the envelope kind of took over, even though when Poe was writing it, letters were sent in a very different way, kind of folded in on themselves, sealed closed. And basically the way that the letter was able to be hidden in plain sight is that the folds were reversed, and it was just kind of placed inside out, readdressed, and then hidden in plain sight. And the reason why this story is so important, those kind of material details I think are interesting, kind of imagining how this letter would have been hiding. But if you've ever taken an English class, read the Scarlet Letter, the English professors like to make a big deal about little details, and kind of draw out, kind of important, kind of understandings of, kind of human psychology or imagination or, kind of what have you. And this understanding of the letter as an enveloped letter hiding in plain sight was the foundation for literary theory by Lacan and Derrida. So it kind of sparked this, the debates that are called the Purloined Poe debates, about how meaning is made, and kind of what it means to turn an envelope inside out. So it's I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole a little bit here, but I think in some ways, attending to the material details of how mail was sent, letters in particular, and other literary forms, magazines, short stories, can really help us kind of get back in the mindset of writers and readers when they were first experiencing and kind of coming into these stories. And I think that kind of understanding, not only can bring us closer to these authors and kind of readers in the past, but can help draw attention to the changing ways that information is transmitted, is likewise influencing the way that we imagine our connections to one another, the way that we understand the speed and interconnectivity of the nation. So I think by kind of marking the contrast between where we are now and kind of what postal exchange might have been like in the 19th century, I think really helps my students see kind of what was different, and then what's remarkable about where we are right now.
That's fascinating. Can I ask what sparked your interest in teaching in this, using this device, using postal history as an explanatory device for literature?
I think largely it came from my research. So the book that I'm working on is part of my dissertation that I was writing when I was in New York, and I think I came into the topic just from reading 19th century fiction, novels by Harriet Beecher Stowe in particular. The post office plays a really important role. But I think even kind of before coming into this, I kind of had more of a heightened awareness, I guess, of postal, the post office just in general, because I grew up in very rural Kansas, where, one of the only buildings you could go into that wasn't your house was the post office. There was public art. It kind of felt like a different kind of space. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, the town that I'm from was on the Pony Express route. So everything in that area is branded Pony Express. And then when I realized that the whole thing was a publicity stunt, like largely more of a publicity stunt than it was an actual viable means of communication, it just kind of, it changed the way that I understood, the post office. So the students, if I may ask, how well do they engage with this kind of material being presented in this way? I think students like it a lot. And I think the post office just as an infrastructure is something that's familiar to them. Everyone's received a letter, kind of has a sense of how to do it. So when you present, so I have several letters that I got on eBay, just really, kind of low bids. There's nothing terribly remarkable about them. I have one here that's from, I think, the 1830s at some point, and I'll bring these into the classroom and then just set them in front of a student and say, what do you notice about this? What can we learn from this letter just as a text itself? And they're really quick to make these kinds of observations. So they'll notice there's no stamp, the postage is handwritten. They'll notice then that there's no envelope, that the letter itself is the envelope, which kind of makes them reconsider expectations of privacy at certain moments. So I think looking at these material objects allows them to kind of make these very basic observations that then are connected to these kind of larger themes that really suffuse the literature of that period. And this letter that I held up, I like a lot as well, because I think it's got, it's from 1834, and there are three writers, three different people who are writing to a single person, and the sheet of paper, as you probably know, is very big, and every spot on the letter is filled with text. And then when we look at the postage, it makes sense why that is, that it would have been very expensive to, for people to send individual letters. So students, I think, are able to learn a lot from these small objects that then they kind of take ownership of that knowledge because they're coming to these conclusions themselves. And it's not necessarily me saying expectations for privacy were different in the 19th century. They're kind of starting to see like what that might actually look like if you're writing a letter to a friend who's in the next town over.
Mm-hmm. So directly following that have any one of your students, either during class or after your class, expressed an interest in continuing research down this path outside of the work that you assign?
I think just in terms of material culture, not necessarily stamp collecting, kind of in particular, but I think it does make students reevaluate the way that they approach the objects in their own homes. Like that has been interesting for me. Because in classes where, I've focused very much on, kind of material culture and this kind of history side of literature, And possibly this is, kind of because I'm teaching students in Massachusetts, but I had a student who ended up writing a paper about a very distant relative's Revolutionary War journal. Which was in his parents' home. So I think in that way, kind of bringing these, kind of small objects from the 19th century into the classroom, it makes them see how other small objects that might be in their houses are connected to this larger narrative of American history. And I think that's really important because I think, seeing how your family fits, seeing how, kind of how you're part of this larger story just really, really matters a lot. I think people are looking for that kind of connection when they study history. So I have had students who just get really into old stuff. I'd have to ask about philately in particular. But
fantastic. So you had emailed me beforehand a copy of an article that you were working on that I wanted to talk about a bit. It was on how the Postal Service dealt with pandemics of the past. Do you mind talking about that for a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this piece, just emerged out of the current moment that we're in now. I think I've been wanting to write some kind of op-ed about the post office for the last 3 years, kind of longer than that, just being kind of the consistent funding struggles and the, kind of, I think largely the misunderstanding of the post office and its fundamental role by many people who operate the federal government. So there's a lot that we could say about the post office right now. But I think I was just really drawn to thinking about how the post office postal delivery changed in pandemics, but also, and I think for me it was a consequence of becoming more reliant on the post office myself. Not going into work anymore. I ordered more things on Amazon. I ordered more things by mail. I had friends who sent, really beautiful letters. I think that kind of social distancing kind of renewed, kind of most people's experience and awareness of the postal system. And I think I was drawn to kind of just seeing how things changed in past epidemics and pandemics. So one of the things that I note and highlight the most in that article is kind of what happened during a smallpox outbreak, part of a decades-long epidemic, if you can even call it that, when it has no, kind of no beginning and no end date. It just kind of carried on throughout for hundreds of years. But when the technology for smallpox vaccines became more portable, so basically when they found out how to kind of dry out the cells and then they didn't need to so then they could convey kind of the vaccine cultures in an envelope, kind of wrap it up in a small piece of paper, kind of apply water or what have you. And then that was a smallpox vaccine. So in the article, I was really struck by how central the post office was to delivering this vaccine, to imagining how to get this vaccine to as many people in the country as possible. And this was the beginning of the 19th century. So in 1813, there was no other way that the federal government could imagine this, kind of arriving to every American than through the mail. And I think that if we are thinking about how the post office kind of exists now, it's never, kind of seen as that, kind of primary, kind of device for delivering things.
It struck me that they were doing this during wartime as well. It's amazing that, right? I mean, this is postal rates were elevated because it was so difficult to deliver mail, and yet they were still able to administer a vaccine by post. I thought was fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. And the Treasury, I think if you got in the weeds with that postal history, the reason why, so Dr. James Smith, who kind of presented this proposal to Congress, he when he gave his presentation, he said he would do this without a salary, and it was largely because he knew that the Treasury was drained because of the war. So, but it was still seen as something that was really important, something that needed to be done to ensure, kind of a safe, secure public life. So that I think then the 1813 vaccine by mail kind of post office act was really fascinating to me. And then just going back a little bit further and seeing how mail delivery needed to change to adapt to the needs of the public when they're kind of living with a contagious disease, I think was really fascinating to me. because we see the post office in operation long before germ theory became kind of the accepted idea. So there were a lot of bad ideas, some in some places, and this was, I believe, during the yellow fever epidemic in the South. Mail was delivered in tar-lined bags, which I was just trying to imagine what it might have been like for a postal worker to carry around like a tar-lined bag and fish out, like what, like the hindrance to that kind of precaution seems pretty substantial to me, but fascinating nonetheless. And I think it's and that was one example. Another was taking letters and perforating them with the special perforation paddles that are just these crazy looking like torture devices that they would kind of stamp all of the envelopes with, and then kind of put, I think it's some kind of sulfur concoction by air into the letters themselves to try to get the germs out, the bad air, the miasma. But even just thinking about how yellow fever spread, it would have done nothing. But the federal government still saw it as important to do something to treat the letters to keep people from harm. So and this was done at great cost, great delay to the mail, some delay to the mail, I guess, in terms of transmission. But the public safety was held kind of as at the highest regard. And I think today we're not necessarily seeing those same values, kind of taking precedent in the way that the post office and postal workers are being asked to do their jobs with very, very little funding and not enough resources even to cover some of the most basic operations of the post office. And part of that research, one of the things that I also looked into, and I don't know if you've spent much time thinking about the Universal Postal Union and how that late 19th century institution kind of changed kind of stamp collecting and the way that stamps worked. But that institution still functions today. And I think they do a lot of good work because they really highlight what international post offices are doing that works well. And I was really struck just looking at some of these international other countries that are still dealing with the pandemic and what they're doing, how they're using the post office to kind of meet the both like social and economic and public health needs of their citizens. So one that I just really liked a lot, the Irish Post Office commissioned a children's activity book that is actually really lovely. It's full of like age appropriate, like self-care, things for kids, ways of dealing with anxiety, ways of dealing with stress, awesome like poems. It's just filled with interesting pandemic related coping material that the post office, kind of commissioned and then delivered to all the kids. And then the Irish Post Office, again, I have a lot of good things to say about it. They're doing wellness checks. So if there are elderly people who are living alone, whose family members might not feel safe, to go out and visit them, postal workers will check in on them and report back.
Wow.
So I think those kind of wellness checks, that kind of trying to meet the social good at some cost, I think can really do a lot. I think it can help with morale, help with kind of real safety concerns, but also just kind of make people feel like they're in this together. And I feel like the post office is still situated to do those kinds of things, but they're being funded at a level that they, again, are barely able to meet the basic operations of the USPS today.
It's interesting when you say that, and I'm reminded too when you said growing up in Kansas, the post office was kind of the only real building in a lot of it. I recently drove through Missouri into Indiana and Illinois and you go through these small towns and basically there's some houses and a post office. And I always thought it was fascinating that in 1935, when it came time to roll out Social Security, it was the post office where you went to receive your Social Security card because it was the only federal building that most towns had. If you're gonna, it's like mailing a vaccine in 1813 or checking on people in Ireland today. The post office, again, for as great as email and Zoom and everything, for as much as that can take away from the post office, the fact still remains that the USPS has a reach that's just unmatched.
Absolutely. Yeah. Not everything can be made digital. Yeah. I think there's some, we're very aware that there's some material things that still need to reach people.
One thing I'm interested in when you talk about and it's sort of going back to the original conversation about the effects of the post on literature, You mentioned the stagecoach in the 1830s, which is interesting, and I hadn't thought of. And then you mentioned that the Pony Express was, I think the Pony Express is more of a cultural force than a practical historic. I mean, obviously, the Pony Express has captured our imagination more than just about anything else. When you look at sort of postal revelations or developments in the 19th century, whether it's the postal reform of 1845, the introduction of federal stamps in 1847, the UPU or rural free delivery, what do you think some of the I'm trying to think the right way to phrase it, some of the underrated changes were, some things that maybe we don't think about? And then is there anything else like the Pony Express that maybe a lot of focus gets ascribed to it, but it might not have had you might not have seen the impact demonstrated practically in your research. What do you think are sort of these milestones, either way, cultural or practical, that have shaped literature and American history at large?
That's great. Yeah, I like that question a lot. I think one of the overlooked, and I guess in a certain way it's policy, but it's kind of just the way that the post office worked, and more in terms of post office routes, coincides with the Pony Express in some ways. But if you look at a map of the U.S. in the 19th century, and see what states are incorporated into the U.S. at a given moment. When we get to 1849, which was the gold rush, you'll see that California kind of sits alone on the West Coast. Kansas is not yet a state. Missouri is not yet a state. But the other part of the U.S. is just kind of on the other side. And I think kind of popular imagination, fueled by this understanding of the Pony Express, would be that the mail just went across this vast wild west. These people on horseback, kind of whatever kind of frontier fantasy you want to imagine, is coupled with that. That's the understanding, I think, of how people would have stayed in communication with California. But if you actually look at the mail routes during that period, this is the mail from the east coast of the U.S. was actually going through Panama, starting in the 1840s. And so there was this really widely used route because so many people moved to California in the 1840s and the 1850s with a promise of wealth. And almost every person who went there traveled by way of Panama on a U.S. mail ship or a steamship that was commissioned to deliver mail. And one of the chapters that I'm working on in my book looks at how this kind of contact with Central America, Panama in particular, gave rise to new narratives. So if you look at kind of the proto-dime novel, the really cheap paperback fiction in this period, so much of it sets Central America, maybe not particularly Panama, but Mexico, and largely because the Mexican-American War was a very recent memory. But the Central America becomes this playground for imagining U.S. identity. And I think part of that is because of the U.S.-Mexican War. But another part of that is because a lot of U.S. citizens or people, who lived in the U.S. Were traveling through Panama to reach California. So I think the international kind of touches, not even necessarily scope, but the way that this national system kind of interacted with international spaces, I think is really overlooked in the 19th century. And I think is really fascinating if you get to that granular level of, okay, if I were mailing a letter from Boston to San Francisco, like where would it actually go? And I think that kind of following those kind of routes has been really illuminating for me, and thinking about how somebody in 1845 or 1849 really kind of might be kind of staying connected to loved ones on a distant coast. That's
incredible. Yeah, I guess.
And to tie it back to the philatelic side of things, when we see those markings via Panama, via Nicaragua, those are exciting to us, because that oftentimes means it's a particularly desirable cover. If it's especially endorsed via Nicaragua, those are big business for us. So that sort of I think marries the philatelic with the social history.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So to go back to the map portion that you were just talking about, you actually on your website had created a map starting in 1709 going to 1817 of all of the U.S. post offices that popped up and the exact month and year that they are created in kind of like in a time loop. It was really interesting. So did you put that together yourself? It pretty interactive too.
Yes. So yes, and there's a reason why it stops at 1817 at this point, and it's just because it took a long fucking time to get all those dots in that, in that map. Yeah, because there are a lot of post offices over the course of the 19th century. But I think it's something that I hope to continue because the U.S. Post Office Department, the archive, is part of the National Archives in D.C., and they have all of these records, when exactly post offices were added, when names were changed, and there are these hundreds of boxes of materials that just are not used at all, or very rarely used. And I think that they can teach us a lot about, even if we want to see, on the town by town level, where were people moving, where were towns added. And I think for me, that's been one of the interesting payoffs of this map, that it's not just when Kansas was added to a state, like suddenly that rectangle was just full of people. The patterns of settlement are, so much more environmentally based, based on railroad routes, based on these other kinds of infrastructures. And that's a fact that totally makes sense. But it took, for me, almost seeing it on the map, like how these postal routes aren't just emerging out of nowhere or on a kind of even basis. Usually, it's coupled with some kind of technology or some kind of waterway. And I think the map also, looking forward into the 18. So I'm hoping to do. I'm hoping to finish it. I'm hoping to have. Initially I was like, I want to go until Kansas's statehood or the end of the Civil War. One of those, either the beginning or the end of the Civil War. But then I was like, no, that's not enough. I want to keep going until and then you can imagine continuing it now with post office closures, I think would be really interesting. So I'm hoping at some point to carry on with that, but I think I'll need some research assistance and more time in DC.
How long did it take you to put together what you have so far?
It took me, it was a good year, but I was working on other projects at the same time. So it was plenty of hours, lots of weekends, just kind of punching in, and finding, and I tried to, because I was trying to balance efficiency, kind of adding, kind of dots to the matrix, but then trying to be as accurate as possible, because some of the names that I would find in Google Maps, didn't correspond with the actual location of where the town would have been in in 1813, for example. Things moved around a little bit, but I'm hoping. So my book project, I'm hoping to finish those at about the same time. So I'm giving it maybe a year and a half, and we'll see, and with the help, I think that that might work that way. But moving further into the 19th century, one of the interesting patterns that also emerged, and is, again, it feels intuitive once you come to this realization, but the moving into Kansas kind of illustrated this. But you see post offices kind of crawling through Kansas, along with the railroad, in Nebraska as well, kind of down through Texas. But Oklahoma just remains a blank spot. And largely, I mean, it was Native American land at that point, so it makes sense that there wasn't, kind of outposts for the U.S. federal government, throughout. But I think it just shows how infrastructure and the way that post offices were added to the system was always political, and kind of tied to, different different values, and might reveal patterns of kind of uneven information exchange that are important to remember, especially when we're imagining how to redress those things in the 21st century.
That seems like while it always follows down the same path, like a side project that you came up with at the same time that probably helps with a lot of the research that you're doing. Is this something that was inspired by the work that you'd already been doing, or is this something that you thought you might just take a stab at?
I think one of the things that's important to me about my research is that it's legible to a broader population. And I think my book, as much as I love it and as much as I kind of polish the prose, like not a lot of people are going to read a book of literary criticism, kind of about 19th century fiction in the post office. Like some people will be really excited about it, and I'm glad, I'm glad about that. But I think something like this map, something that's just kind of visually like attractive and kind of conveys information in a different way, almost opens up the audience for understanding how the post office might have been different, how it continues to change. And that's really important to me. So I don't want to just reach an audience of other academics or, kind of interested, kind of people. I kind of want to make some of this information legible to a broader public.
We were talking about Edgar Allen, or you were talking about Edgar Allan Poe earlier. Are there any other, is there a short story or a book, somebody listening who has never made these connections between the Post and literature before, is there a 19th century novel or short story that you think people should check out, that you think illustrates the research you're trying to convey? Is there something you would recommend to maybe somebody who has, again, who's never thought about these worlds intersecting before? Where would you point them?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think if you want a good story and, kind of how the post office, kind of maybe was freighted with a different kind of like emotional weight, Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, I think it's hard to beat. So if you've read it, we have Bartleby, the central character, who's very befuddling, kind of refuses everything, seems very depressed, kind of down. And his boss comes to the conclusion that he is in this state because of his work at the dead letter office. The story is much more complicated and interesting than that. But then thinking about the dead letter office and what that might have looked like and meant to people in the 1850s, I think shows kind of how the post office was set in a slightly different register. And then a second one, if you have more time and I think more patience for 19th century prose, I don't know if you're familiar with, it's James Holbrook's 10 Years Among the Mailbags. Which is
I have a couple of ancient editions of it sitting on my bookshelf, because that's one I love. Whenever I see that in an older edition of that, I have to pick it up.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, I think it's kind of just talks about what it was like to be a postal inspector in is it the 1850s, I think. So it's you get a lot of those material details of the post office, and he writes it in a way that's trying to sensationalize a lot of what he's finding. So a lot of the people who he encounters, he writes much like they are characters from sensational fiction. So the nosy postmistress who's looking at everybody's letters, he probably really encountered that person, but he also writes her as if she's a character from a Jane Austen novel or something like that. So Charles, let's see. Yeah, so that's.
I wanted to go grab just a copy fantastic. It is not for everyone. I agree that it requires some. Yeah. Even as an invested philatelist, it's a tough one, but I agree that it's very unique in its portrayal of. Yeah, I won't get distracted by it now, but I'm glad you mentioned that one, because it's
what year was that?
Fantastic. This edition's 1888.
Wow.
I think the original was in the 1850s, but I'm not.
That's what I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, not entirely sure of the fact, but yeah.
A mailbag is an epitome of human life. That's a bold opening sentence.
Yeah.
I'm not sure many people would agree with that today, but yeah. I'm really glad you mentioned that one, because that's a really special book.
So yeah, and my book that I'm writing kind of. It gathers together a lot of moments. It's less about kind of single books, but thinks about how travel writing in the 1830s just emerged from these. But a lot of the travel writers themselves didn't really care too much about the post office. They'll mention, we stopped at the post office, I got off, and went and had lunch somewhere else. So it does show up, but it's always kind of
back of mind.
Kind of background, almost, which I think is interesting too. I think that it was already hidden in plain sight in a way.
And Washington Irving is often credited as being sort of the first uniquely American, that's sort of the birth of American literature. And it's interesting to think that the Post may have had, the Postal Service may have played a role in, I guess it was natural that we would develop our own literary style at some point, whether it was Irving or somebody else. But it's interesting. I'd never considered that the post office may have, in a roundabout way, contributed to the birth of American literature as its own unique, separate from what was going on in Europe. It's interesting gives me even more appreciation for the post office than I already had, which was a considerable amount to begin with.
Tough to do.
Yeah, and I think there is an interesting, kind of counterpoint in visual arts as well. Charles, you mentioned the monograph about post office paintings, and so much of 19th century American art is about kind of the landscape, kind of beautiful, very striking, sublime landscapes. And if you think about it, or if you go through and kind of look at the details of how these artists got from place to place, they were writing postal infrastructure to get to Niagara Falls. They would have been riding the stagecoach to get there. So oftentimes these things that seem like they're kind of just coming out of the ether are actually really dependent on public infrastructures, like the post office in the 19th century.
Wow.
And just this is the monograph,
Oh,
19th
nice.
century American genre painting. I can't read because it's
Yeah, I need that. That's
papers in
great.
tavern post offices. I'll send you guys each a copy, and if anyone else listening wants a copy, I've got about a dozen of them here. So send an email, and I'll mail you one of these. But I think it is interesting how again I haven't really thought about it much until talking to you, but how sort of the birth of American culture and art and literature all is so inexorably tied to the post office. That was kind of all we had to get to Niagara Falls, or to the railroads, the steamships were all so linked to the post. It's really hard to imagine the history of this country without the mail.
Yeah.
Right, and even if you're thinking about what was traveling, because I think the travel writing shows us what was traveling alongside the mail. But those postal policies in the middle decades of the 19th century also, they opened up what could be sent through the mail. So magazine culture, cheap paperback fiction, the kind of novels about Panama and Mexico are they were made to send by mail, and that just opened up. No longer did booksellers have to go from store to store, but they could kind of just reach their readers directly by mail order. So at the end of the 19th century, those changes, I think, emerged in really interesting ways inside the mailbag.
So can I ask you a bit about how you did your research? Or where did you look to put all this information together for your book, for your students? You mentioned where you got the mapping information from, but where are you pulling the research from for your class and for your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love going to archives, so just research libraries. And I did my PhD in New York. I was at Fordham University, and I think that being in New York after living in Kansas, where there aren't so many kind of research archives, I was just as excited to go to as many as I could, and I knew I wanted to write about the post office. So then I would go to the New York Public Library and just request any primary source rare materials that they had that were tied to postal history. So they have one of the things that they have there that I just really like as an object is the postal register from Newport, Rhode Island, from what is it, 1770 to 1772 or something like that. So it's like an important moment. And it's just this log of all the mail that passed in and out of Newport. And it's fascinating, like that has to matter in some way. And so I think I was almost gathering these really interesting objects. So the postal ledgers, in that case, postal maps, postal routes in other cases, and just really thinking about how those material details, those ways of sorting information would have had measurable influences on the kinds of fictions that people would write. So kind of how people's imaginations would stretch. So I think, it's a little bit piecemeal in some ways, kind of looking from archive to archive and kind of learning about how the post office looked and doing that around New York at first, then Philadelphia a little bit later on. The National Archives has a lot of resources as well. So I'm kind of drawing from a lot of those places. Yeah, and it's been a lot of fun because the post office is really good at keeping records. There's a lot of them around. So.
Yeah, we actually spoke with Jenny Lynch, the
cool.
historian at the 2 weeks ago. Actually, we learned a lot from her. Well, I have run out of questions, unfortunately.
This has been one of my favorite conversations we've had with anyone. We really appreciate you taking the time, and as your studies and everything progress, maybe we can catch back up with you down the line and do this again, I think would be a lot of fun. Because not that we don't enjoy every conversation we have, but there's certainly ones that stand out. And this has been, just again, a totally different way of thinking. Michael and I spend basically every day thinking about mail. Like we can't escape it. It's our lives. And to come at it from such a different viewpoint is unique. Sometimes I feel like we've done just about all the thinking about the post office we can, and then this opened. Now I'm going back thinking about books I've read recently, like how do they relate to the post office? And I think again, I hope people enjoy this one, because for me this has been really fascinating, and we just really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us and for the work that you're doing. It's so interesting, and using the post office as a teaching tool is not something that I hear of that often. Even in myself in college, I had wished that obviously because I was involved in philately already, that my history teachers or English teachers, such as yourself, had used it as a teaching tool, but it never quite made the textbooks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, here's hoping we can change that. Yeah, it's such a fun part of the conversation. I think it's a great way into history. It's a great way into thinking about kind of the way that information transmission has changed over time as well. So
yeah.
Thank you. So thank you for the conversation. Do you know any good post office jokes? I have one post office joke.
I'd love to hear it.
I don't know any, so no. I'm...
Have you heard the one about this the letter without a stamp?
No.
You wouldn't get it.
That's
I'm gonna have to use that one.
That's great.
Yeah, it's so bad it's good. That's my one.
That's great. Wow, that's really funny. Thank you so much.
Cool. Well, thanks, guys. Take good care.
Yeah.
You too. Thanks so much.
Talk to you soon, and stay safe.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
So, Michael, did that live up to your expectations? Because I think that was one of the best conversations we've ever had.
That was a fantastic way to start off. The last episode, we spoke to Ryan and Jess. It was.
Let me tell you something. If there's one thing our listeners love, it's when we try and explain the schedule to them. When we try and get into the weeds of what day we had the conversation versus when it was edited. That's what people keep asking for more of. It's like, can you go into more of the back office housekeeping stuff?
Right.
So let's just say that was a great way to kick off the year. And presumably people aren't going to be like, wait a minute, Ryan and Jessica debuted on the 4th. Michael lied when he said people aren't going to care that much. So let's just say that was a great way to kick off the year.
That was a great way to kick off the year.
Like I said, when we were talking to her, we think about mail so much. Like our lives, I look behind you, you look behind me, our lives are strong. To have somebody come in and like still change the way we look at things. You talk to most collectors and it's like, oh, like I've thought about, this postal history usage before. But it sort of ties into something. But again, to have somebody just come in out of left field and be like, I look at Washington Irving and the mail. It's like, I think it's fascinating. I think it's fantastic. I maybe it's because my background is in I was a history minor when I was in college. Maybe it's because that's how I came into the hobby in the first place, was through history. But to have somebody who just looks at it in such a unique way, I really relate to, and I really get excited by.
Yeah, that's exactly the point of this interview, is we were looking for something that was slightly different than what we normally do. She had so much information that we just don't normally think of. And I think the pandemic mail portion, where they were mailing out vaccines to people to assemble themselves like an IKEA chair, and then take the smallpox vaccine from the mail. I mean, that's absolutely incredible.
If you told somebody in 1813 that it was like an IKEA chair, they probably would have looked at you like you had two heads.
Yeah, they would. When was IKEA?
That's not the point of this podcast. Now, the next challenge for you, Michael, is I want to find a pure mathematics professor who uses postal history in their lesson planning
to decipher quantum mechanics.
Exactly, like a physics professor. And real quick stories. I started talking to you about this before we started recording, but I was taking a history of the Revolutionary War class in college, and the professor our final assignment was to write an essay about the Revolutionary War. I don't remember the assignment specifically, but I said that I wanted to write my essay about stamps commemorating the 150th anniversary of the end of the war that were released in like 1926, 27, 28. I said, I want to look at how the war was depicted on postage stamps in the 1920s.
Was it a legitimate historical depiction of the Revolutionary War, or was this the 1920s imposing their cultural zeitgeist on things that were a century and a half old? I explained this to my professor. I said, I've got this great idea for a paper. He thought I was a lunatic for suggesting this. I probably was a lunatic for suggesting this, but I wrote a paper that I was really proud of.
Yeah.
And
A plus?
I think it shows that, again, you can use stamps to go all these different directions. We talked to Dr. Pottroff. She looks at how the post office affected how history in the post. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this.
Yeah, how the post office affected history.
How the post office affected history, and then you get into the 20th century, and all of a sudden the post office is imprinting
Reflecting
itself on historical. Exactly, it's going the other direction.
Yeah.
And sort of changing historical narratives with how stamps depict history. So I feel very sort of invigorated by this conversation that we had, because I feel like now I want to go think about this in so many other ways. Books I've read that have to do with the post office, or stamps depicting historical events. There's just so many different avenues I want to go with this. I think this really was an eye-opening conversation for me personally.
Yeah, absolutely. And you got to think this was almost an hour-long interview. She teaches a course on this. So I'm
going to enroll at BC, I think, just to take this course.
Yeah, she teaches a full course load on this. So a full semester's worth of information where she compares literary works and the impact that the post office had on them. So I just cannot imagine how much more information there is out there on this topic.
Let's re-enroll. We can be like those older freshmen who you always have wonder about.
Yeah. I saw that Vince Vaughn movie.
Yeah, I was gonna say we go back to college. We can join a stamp fraternity.
Mm-hmm.
It would be fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Really, I haven't had a proper excuse to use a backpack in about 10 years.
I can only imagine how interesting this class is, and I wish I had something similar while I was...
Right, yeah. I mean, I touched upon that briefly, but involved in philately, I kept waiting for the day that I'd show up to history class and they'd talk about the post office, or the creation of the post office, and how it affected westward expansion. And it just never came. They never put the post office in history. And maybe I was taking the wrong classes. Obviously, I was.
Yeah. We should have been at Boston College.
Yep, right now.
Well, Michael, this was fun. As always, people listening can find us on Spotify, Google, Apple, YouTube.
Wherever you find your podcasts, wherever you find your YouTubes.
Well, like I mentioned, if anybody wants a copy of Robert and Diane's excellent monograph on 19th century genre painting, I've got a couple of them. Harmer has an ad on the back page, so nice. This is my selfish plug here. But if you would like one of these, I've got a couple of them. The first couple of people that email philatelypodcast@gmail.com, I will send one of these to as a gift from Conversations with Philatelists.
That is our first giveaway.
Our first giveaway. So let's say the first 10 people to email in the next 15 minutes. The first 10 people to email, I will send these to.
Perfect.
And if you're the 11th, I'll probably feel guilty and send you one as well. Yeah, please get in touch with us if you'd like one.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm gonna put all the links for Dr. Pottroff's website.
You didn't tell me about this map beforehand. I want to go play around with this now.
Yeah, it's super interesting. You just click play, and every single month of every single year, starting from 1709 to 1817, it shows you how the post offices, when they started popping up. I found Concord, New Hampshire. It was April 1793. Concord, New Hampshire post office just popped up on the screen. And it is really interesting because you can zoom in, you just hit play, you can see the post offices populate, and it's really interesting. I'm looking forward to her finishing it and then maybe selfishly hoping she puts the mail routes in there in between the post offices. It sounds like she needs more work to do.
Yeah, I was going to say you're laying out her next several years of research for her.
Right. Yeah, maybe we can hire her an assistant. Conversations with Philatelists sponsored assistant to help her populate this map.
Michael, this has been a lot of fun. Next week we've got a big one.
Yeah.
Next week we've got a really exciting one. Somebody who is unbelievably instrumental in my long-term participation in the hobby. I think you as well.
Oh yeah.
One of not just a great collector, but one of the kindest, most generous men on the face of the earth, I would say. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to leave it at that. But
okay.
we're going to leave it at that. It's not Bill Gates, but it's going to be a really fun one. It's going to be a really exciting one, and I'm looking forward to that. So, this week and this week and next week back to back, I think we're already kicking off the new year on a really good note.
Yeah, it's exciting stuff.
Michael, as always, this was awesome. We'll talk real soon.
Yeah. See you next time.
Sounds good.
All right.